Welcome to your first biology lesson for Science 10, which is on the topic of genetics. So genetics is the biology focus for Science 10 and connects back with some of the concepts you learned during Science 9, as well as some things from Science 8. So for example, you were taught usually an overview of DNA, you were taught about mitosis, meiosis, sexual, asexual reproduction, and taught about kind of the structure of the cell. So all of these play into our topic of genetics. So let's break down genetics. So starting with section 1.1. In this unit, the main concepts covered are, so today, for example, we're going to focus on DNA structure, function, and the genes and chromosomes. And then we're also going to go into mechanisms for diversity of life, mutation and its impact on evolution, natural and artificial selection, and simple patterns of inheritance. So how are things passed down the family line? So your notes should match through with these videos quite well. So you should be taking notes kind of as you're watching these videos, and then going back and double checking things and then asking questions, obviously, if you get stuck. So the first kind of section you come to in your notes is this key concepts for the unit. So this is mainly for when you're in class. You'll want to take a peek in the textbook, which I'll see if I can upload digital copies as well. Fill kind of these sections in with what you think are the most important things. And then obviously this should connect with page 8 in the textbook. This page is to help you recognize the key terminology for the unit. So these are the key terms you are expected to know by the end of the unit. And what I want you to do is write a definition in your own words. By the end of the unit, you should have a good grasp on these terms. It may be helpful, as well as feel free to Google the definitions of these terms to help gain a better understanding of what each term means. Make sure these definitions are written in your own words. So don't just cut and paste from Google. That defeats the purpose of this activity. Google will also likely give you complicated or elaborate long definitions that you may not actually understand. So make sure definition as well is also applied to genetics. So for example, something like protein comes up in food and nutrition as well. So we're not talking about protein in food here, we're talking about proteins that are occurring in your cell, in your body. Please be aware of the term allele, as this is a term that causes a lot of students confusion. So if towards the end of the unit you're still like, I have no idea what an allele is, I don't understand the definition, please make sure you're asking. But I would like you to try and figure out these terms yourself through the videos, through your own research, as that's kind of the best way for you to make connections with these terms. In your notes, before these 7 characteristics of life, there are a few pages that mention assigned readings. Please make sure you have read through these first. You can read them after, however, you may then want to go back to these videos and kind of refresh your memory on some of these and try and make connections, okay? So to begin, you are required to know each of the 7 characteristics of life, as well as a description of each. So I'm going to talk you through each of these. So to start off, all living things must reproduce and produce offspring. If an organism can't produce babies, essentially, or offspring in some way, even if this is through something like cloning, it is not considered to be alive. So reproduction can be through sexual or asexual reproduction, which is tying this back into Science 9. Next, we go into metabolism. So all living things require food or some kind of energy. So think plants don't take in food, they take in sunlight, which produces their food. And they all produce some kind of waste product as a result. So number 3, homeostasis. All living things require a balanced internal environment. So for humans, for example, our body tends to function at an average of about 37 degrees Celsius. At 40 degrees Celsius, this is considered a fever. So between 37 and 40 is where our body functions relatively normally. And if you go above into that fever range, this is where it starts to impact our body functions. Number 4, stimuli. All living things respond to stimuli. This is the organism having some kind of sense of hot, cold, dry, wet, etc., and then responding to that external stimuli. Okay, so continuing on, we then go into growth and development. So all things grow. The body uses cell division to grow and repair throughout the lifespan of the living organism. And then we go into number 6, which is heredity, so an adaptation through evolution. So the genetically determined characteristic of living things are passed on to their offspring. And through mutation and survival of the fittest, which is something called natural selection, this may lead to evolution through time. So heredity is likely new for this year, and it is our focus for section 1.13. Number 7 is our last characteristic of life, and this is cellular organization. So all living things are made up of one or more cells, and these cells communicate together to usually carry out a function. It is ultimately the cell and its complex organization that allowed for the evolution and diversity of life as we know it today. What is it within the cell that has led to so much variation in living things? The answer lies in the nucleus of a eukaryotic cell. So notice here we're focusing on the eukaryotic cell. So remember that a prokaryotic cell, so this is back to Science 8, does not have a nucleus. Section 1.1, so this matches your textbook, is on the nucleus, which is the control center of the cell. So every cell in your body has a specific job, but how do they become special? For example, a hair cell is very different than a skin cell, which is very different than cells in the retina of the eye. So each one of these cells has a unique function that is very different from the other type of cell. So how do these cells become specialized, and how do they do different things? The key here is in the nucleus of that cell. So the nucleus of the eye, or the retina cell, for example. The nucleus contains chromosomes, and those chromosomes are made up of DNA. And that DNA is what provides the instructions for how the cell will function and what its specific job is. So the nucleus in the cell contains a master set of instructions that tells the cell all of the following: what it will do, how it will function, when it will reproduce and grow, and when it will die to the end of life. So this is a full life cycle of a cell. So how does the nucleus do this? How does it send messages to the rest of the cell? How do we know when it's going to grow or when it's going to die? So, point 1, the nucleus contains DNA, which carries the master set of instructions for the cell to function. So the super important focus here is DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And yes, you do need to know this term and know how to spell this term. It is a double-stranded helix, meaning twisted, that looks like a twisted ladder. The sides of the DNA are made up of sugar and phosphates. So if I imagine a ladder, the kind of sides are here. This is what's called the sugar phosphate backbone. So this is the backbone of the ladder. Then we have the steps of the DNA are made up of 4 nitrogenous, which just means nitrogen-containing bases. So you need to know these 4. So the steps, or the rungs of the ladder, so if you think of this as the part that if we were actually visualizing a ladder, this is the part that you would step up onto, are made up of nitrogenous bases connected together by hydrogen bonds. So the steps are referring to this part in here, so in the center. So let's talk about a little bit more about the bases themselves. So adenine and guanine are double-ringed structures known as purine. Cytosine and thymine are single-ringed structures known as pyrimidines. So to help you remember this, it's a little bit weird and backwards, but I like to remember that purine, the shorter word, refers to the bigger structure, and pyrimidine, the larger word, refers to the smaller single-ring structure. If this helps, use it. If it doesn't, you may want to try and come up with a different kind of memory trick to help you remember these. So the single sugar phosphate base unit is called a nucleotide. So this entire structure, phosphate, deoxyribose sugar, or the type of sugar, and the base, make up the nucleotide. So the nucleotide must contain all of that. So it contains one phosphate, one base, which could be adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine, must be included for it to be a nucleotide. This is where the nucleic acid comes from in the name DNA. So the nucleic acid is not so much referring to the nucleus as it is referring to the nucleotide. So let's go into some pairing rules here. Adenine, which we shorten to A, always pairs with thymine. Cytosine, C, always pairs with guanine, G. So to remember this, adenine, thymine, apple tree, cytosine, guanine, car garage. In the diagram, up in the top right corner, A and G are double rings. So they're symbolized by the larger rectangles, as you can kind of see here. C and T are your pyrimidines. They're your single ring structures, and they're symbolized by the smaller kind of square. So notice that there's always one big one paired with one small one. Never two smalls or two bigs paired together. And this is to allow the DNA to twist up into that helix structure. If it wasn't paired properly, this wouldn't work. There is always one big one with one small one purine with one pyrimidine. And if you look between the C and G in the diagram, you'll notice that there's 3 bonds, and these are hydrogen bonds specifically. And between A and T, there are 2 bonds. So the difference between why it forms 2 versus 3 bonds is related to the structure of the bases. This is beyond kind of science 10. It is always one purine with one pyrimidine, and A always bonds with T, G always bonds with C in DNA. So these are things you're expected to know. So let's now zoom into our DNA. So we're looking here on the left-hand side, our coiled ladder, our twisted helix, which is on the left. And then if we were to flatten that ladder out and untwist it, you would have the ladder on the right. Again, we have guanine, symbolized by G, always paired with cytosine, C. And we see the 3 bonds in between. Adenine, A, always bonds with thymine, T, and we see 2 bonds. Each base is attached to the sugar in the backbone, never the phosphate, which is symbolized by the P here. The phosphate pairs the 2 sugars together, so it sits in between each sugar. And this is what forms our sugar phosphate backbone of DNA. So now you try. So this is to help you check your understanding. So this is not in your notes. Looking at this picture, you want to think about, where are the bases located? Can you find them? If you can't, you need to send me a message and I will clarify for you. You also need to be able to name each of the 4 bases. What does each letter mean in the image above? What does it stand for? And this is all in your notes. Where are the sugars and phosphates located? And then what is the overall shape of DNA called? So for this last section here, I would like you to take a few minutes, pause, and review these questions. So for number 1, for example, if bases on one strand of DNA are A, T, G, GGC, CTA, what is the sequence of the complementary bases on the other strand? So this is representing one strand. What does the other look like? What is it paired with? So for instance, I'm going to give you a small example just to help you understand this, because I did find that some students do get confused with this concept. If I have T, for example, the opposite strand that it's paired with, A pairs with T, C pairs with G, T pairs with A. So this is your complementary strand. And then I would like you to think about an analogy to describe the base pairs. And then if you can, share them with a classmate. Obviously, question 2 is a bit of a challenge because you'll be working alone in some cases. But if there is anybody online or anybody that in the class that you know, share your analogy. And I may have you post these analogies as they can be super helpful in helping you to understand these concepts. Okay, so follow the rest of the schedule, and that is it for the video lesson component.